Looking forward to a great discussion. Ambassador Hill, I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you very much, and let me welcome you all here. It is a great pleasure for me to be back here. I want to thank Larry Meisel for once again putting this together with his really excellent team here, and especially to thank Senator Udall for really hosting this event. Now, what we have in mind here is to maybe have a free-flowing but pretty rapid-fire discussion of some of the problems out there in the world, because this is now the 11th year after 9/11, and lo and behold, the world is still a pretty troubled and in many cases a very dangerous place. So in kind of looking at all the issues we confront today, we tried to put together a sort of set of issues and maybe discuss those in some sequence. And the first is the issue of nuclear aspirations from countries that, frankly speaking, ought to be doing something else, like playing with their children or something. But so we have, I think, probably the most urgent one today is Iran. And there are often some conflicting signals coming out of Iran, but as we learned just today, as Senator Udall pointed out, we have the Iranians not cooperating with the inspectors that they said they would cooperate with just some 3 days ago. So I think Iran is sort of on the top 10 list. But I would also like, in the context of talking about nuclear aspirants, to raise the always fun, always entertaining North Koreans. The North Koreans were not denied their place in world news in the last few months. Kim Jong-il, who had been Kim Jong very ill for a while, became no longer. And so he was replaced by his rather well-fed son, Kim Jong-un. And so his name is actually Jong-un. You don't just call him Un. And so Kim Jong-un, I think there are a lot of fair questions about whether he is sort of ready for prime time. As is usual with North Korea, we don't know a lot about it. It's a place that the word opaque, I think, is a good description, and it's a country that really kind of takes pride in its opaqueness. So I think that would be an issue to talk about in the context of these nuclear wannabes. I think we're going to talk about Pakistan in terms of a second category, but I think Pakistan could also be in the category of a country whose nuclear stockpile is of concern. After all, if one wanted to take an alarmist view, and often an alarmist view is probably a sober view, they are sort of one angry mob away from a loose nuke. Afghanistan is one angry mob and maybe about 300 years away from a loose nuke. But nonetheless, I think to talk about Afghanistan together with Pakistan makes some sense. And finally, in this category, I think we also ought to be discussing the situation in Iraq. I mean, in both these places, Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States has begun, I think, a very important withdrawal, strategic withdrawal of our forces in Iraq. Our forces are already out of the country. In Afghanistan, the expectation is that in the next couple of years or so, and maybe before, we will also have U.S. military forces out of there. Now, some newspapers, if you read the press, already has kind of written the narrative that in Iraq, U.S. forces leave, all heck breaks loose. I would argue, as someone who spent some time there, is what we're seeing breaking loose in Iraq is a very tough form of local politics. Not nearly as tough as what we've got going in the U.S., of course. I mean, they're kind of amateurs compared to what goes on here. But I think we also have something that is very dangerous in Iraq, and that is the notion that there's some kind of great game underway, that Iran thinks that maybe Iraq is a place where they could exert influence for some years to come, while the Sunni Arab countries already very much concerned about what is going on in the Sunni Arab world in the Arab Spring, otherwise known as the Arab Thing, because first of all, it has nothing to do with spring. It's been going on longer than that. And frankly, when you start disaggregating what's going on in the Arab world, you'll see there's a lot of complexity there. But one thing among Sunni Arab countries is they'd rather not see a Shia Arab country, which is really what Iraq has become. So I think there are a lot of interesting elements to Iraq, and of course in Afghanistan, because that is where it all began. That is where people who came and attacked our cities, attacked our people, that is where they were trained, and that is why that is also an issue, important issue we need to discuss. And then I think finally it's very important to see sort of how kind of buttoned up we are. How are we prepared to face these threats in our homeland? And I think we're very fortunate to have on this panel someone who can really speak to those issues. What are the new threats? They're not all the threats that we confronted on September 12th, 2001. There are other things, and I think Senator Udall spoke very eloquently about the issue of cyber threats and other things like that, threats to our homeland. So we've got a huge agenda. I think we've got something like 45 minutes to go through this huge agenda, followed by, I think, a question period of some 25 minutes. Someone's supposed to be giving a chopping signal to her neck when I've gone on too long, so I'll look for her to do that. But why don't we start really with a discussion about the situation in Iran. After all, this is a situation where we have gotten a number of countries to work together with us. We've gotten we've gotten countries such as in Europe, we have support there. We've had a real effort at multilateralism, and I think also there's a growing sense that countries are prepared to initiate some fairly harsh sanctions. A number of the European countries are going to do that. In fact, the European Union, I think, is going to be prepared to complete that process by June. I know the Republic of Korea is also looking to free themselves of Iranian oil. So let me start with a sort of softball question to Senator Udall. Do you think these sanctions are going to work? And if they don't, what's next?
I think we should do everything possible to give these sanctions an opportunity to work. The two things that are keeping me up at night are the financial situation in Europe and what's happening in Iran. That's not to say what's happening in Syria, Egypt, and Korea, as well as our own economic straits, aren't very, very important. There are some significant signs that the sanctions are biting. The rial has dropped about 50% in valuation. You could argue that these clumsy attacks against Israeli diplomats in capitals around the world are an indication that the Iranians are lashing out. The plot to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington, as ham-handed and comical as it sounded, is real and was real. And by the way, we should tip our hats to leaders like Admiral Winnefeld and Ken Weinstein, who put in place the structures so that our domestic law enforcement and counterterrorism efforts were successful in that undertaking. That's the good news. The bad news is the bad guys only have to get it right once, and that's why we've got to be ever vigilant. There are sanctions that are back to Iran that are going to follow on that will be even more biting. As I said, every option should be left on the table, but one of the reasons that I think we have to continue to push these sanctions is once you begin to engage militarily, you never quite know what is going to come next, whether it was Israel, the United States, or Israel in concert with the United States attacking Iran. Potentially you unleash a lot of forces over which we don't have much control. I'll end on this note. The worst thing in the world would be to get into a war with Iran, but an even worse thing would be if they're a nuclear power, because it would change the geopolitical balance in the region. The Saudis would want a Sunni bomb. The Iraqis would be tempted themselves. Any country with significant oil revenues could probably buy a set of nuclear weapons. And we also have, of course, the comments that Ahmadinejad, Khamenei, and other Iranian leaders have made about Israel. I think we should take those comments seriously. But those two possibilities, the Iranians actually using a bomb, which would be suicidal, but you never know when a madman might lead a country, and the change of the geopolitical balance are unacceptable for the long-term stability of the world.
Senator, one of the issues has always been on sanctions is whether they're enforceable. I mean, whether we can really get countries to support those. I wonder if either of our other panelists want to speak to the issue of sanctions enforcement and whether we can really make them stick with Iran. Admiral?
Well, I would say that we're seeing a lot of success with that right now with Iran. We're getting a lot of cooperation, as you pointed out, I think, from our European partners. The European Union has really ratcheted this up. I think one of you also mentioned the Republic of Korea. We would, of course, like to see a little more cooperation out of a couple of other key nations in the world, China being one, to reduce their oil imports from Iran, and there are others as well. But these things are starting to bite. They're going to get worse and tighter as the year goes on. Starting in June and July, the automatic mechanisms are going to tighten them up even more, and we are starting to see the pinch, as you've pointed out.
We've seen already the Iranians try to sort of bite back by saying, well, they're going to cut out the UK from Iranian oil. Of course, the UK only gets 1% of their oil from Iran. But overall, on the issue of sort of biting back, looking for ways to come back at us for this, I wonder, Ken, if you can talk about some of that from a homeland security perspective.
Yeah, I think we need to brace ourselves. We need to be prepared because you're already hearing rhetoric that they're saying that they're victims of economic terrorism, that they're victims of terrorism themselves, which many read as sort of a prelude to their using terrorism in retaliation for the sanctions. Obviously, the same thing would be doubly true if there's some sort of military action against them, and no matter where that military action came from, the betting is that the retaliation would come back at us. Historically, Iran has not focused terrorist efforts against the homeland, against the U.S., and for very practical reasons. They've worried that our retaliation for that would be so severe that it just doesn't pass the cost-benefit analysis. They haven't had Hezbollah come after us. We had, a murder here back in the 1980s where Iranians killed somebody, but they haven't done that until recently. And the Senator mentioned that plot where the Iranians it was a pretty ham-handed thing. Many people don't believe that it was actually sanctioned at the highest levels of the Iranian government, but apparently the evidence is there that there was Quds Force involvement. The Quds Force is an arm of the Revolutionary Guard of the Iranian government, and a member of the Quds Force is actually charged with that offense. It was ham-handed, but they were trying to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in the United States in Washington, D.C. Many people are concerned that that is a change in course for the Iranians, and might be a function of them lashing out as a result of these sanctions. So I think you're seeing in the homeland and national security infrastructure a readying for what might come even short of any military action directed at Iran.
Chris, if I can add to what Ken said, these four recent plots, Thailand, India, Georgia, and of course the plot for the ambassador here, as clumsy as they were, it indicates sort of a brazen approach that these guys are willing to reach out into other people's capitals, and they don't seem to care about the effects. And so what that tells us is that one of these days they might be successful someplace. And so they only have to get one through. We have to defend perfectly against every single one of them. And in that light, one of the best things that I've had a chance to observe in over the last 10 years is the tremendous, and Senator, you all can attest to this by virtue of his position on the intelligence community, is the tremendous improvement in our intelligence community's crosstalk and cooperation with one another. It's remarkable to see how far they've come in 10 years, and you've seen, and sometimes you haven't seen, the results of that cooperation.
Senator, you've had the opportunity to get out to the region to talk to some governments out there. What's your sense from the region about their willingness to really stand up to Iran? What I worry about is you have the Saudis being very tough now, but if it ever came to using military power, if we used overflights of Saudi Arabia, we might get a kind of different point of view. What's your sense, having gone out to the region and talked to a number of governments?
My sense is almost to a country, there's deep concern about a nuclear-armed Iran. There's also a hope that the Israelis, who are of course scapegoated in many other settings, or the Americans, or both, will take out the Iranian threat, however you want to define that threat. But Master, as you point out, it's a complicated part of the world. You certainly have to put a lens that takes into account Shia and Sunni perspectives, but then you also have historical trends. You have countries that are rich in oil, others that aren't. It's a fascinating part of the world if it wasn't so doggone unstable and such a threat to all that we hold dear.
What I worry about with Iran is, and I went through this when I was in Iraq, we have those hikers, you remember, who kind of inexplicably decided that the best place in the world to go, I mean, if they just came to Colorado, I mean, how many mountains? So, but instead of coming to Colorado, they go out from Sulaymaniyah, and lo and behold, they get arrested by Iranian border guards. Sulaymaniyah is a town in the eastern part of Iraq, the northeastern part of Iraq. And then they released one of the hikers, the woman, and then it was very clear there were these internal problems in Iran where they simply couldn't decide what to do with the other two. And it took them something like 2 years. This was long after they realized these were not threats, that they were basically people sort of challenged by their IQ to go up to mountain climbing next to Iran. But they were no threat at all. It took them 2 years.
I'm sorry, I was saying I'm a mountain climber. Be careful.
So,
and I think we should talk a little more about Iran and if not exhaust the topic. I think there are a couple other comments I'd like to make. D.N.I. Clapper, who heads the intelligence architecture in the federal government, and Admiral Linenfeld mentioned how we're much more integrated. I know Mike Davis is here from the FBI, or formerly the FBI now works for the governor. Our Homeland Security efforts here was a part of this. But let's see, I lost my train of thought. Director Clapper was saying it's clear, and he said this in open session, so I can share with you, that the Iranians haven't made the final decision to go. At the same time, there's discussion of the zone of immunity as to the point at which Iran can fend off any attempts to deny them the capability to make a nuclear weapon. I would like to say that I know there's a school of thought that given the intense nationalistic fervor of Iranians, formerly Persians, they've been a nation for many, many years, that were we to attack Iran, the narrative would be this is the very reason that we need to have a bomb within Iran. If we had a bomb, we wouldn't have been attacked. I don't know how we thread that needle. I'll continue to say we keep all options on the table, but one of the things we're playing for is time. The Iranian population is 65 to 70% under the age of 35. They're very Western-oriented. They have affection for the United States, which may surprise some Americans. I think it would surprise the Iranian leadership. And if we can continue in a manner in which they make the right decision, and this new youthful cohort takes control over the country, then I'm hopeful. But that's a thin reed right now in which to hold our hopes. But it's the most vexing problem and challenge I've faced in my 13 years in the Congress, and I speak for all of us who sit on the Intelligence Committee. We're spending a lot of time understanding what the options are and what the best course of action may be.
I think it's very important what we've done in Iran is to continue to get support from our friends and allies with the understanding that Iran is a problem to us. Frankly, I think it's a threat to us. But we're not the only country under threat. There are many other countries. And what's, I think, very important is to make sure that we approach this multilaterally such that if we ever have to go to all those options on the table, we will have support from others, and we will do that together in coalition.
You make peace with your enemies, unfortunately, and so the diplomatic path is one down which we have to continue to travel. In the end, you also have to ask yourself, what is the reason for the use of force? Clausewitz famously said, war is an extension of politics. What is the end state? Were we to attack Iran, were the Israelis to attack Iran? What is the outcome we want to generate? Thinking that by attacking them, we're going to somehow eliminate their capacity to develop nuclear weapons is, I think, flawed thinking, or at least short-term thinking. This is why the history that will be written, hopefully a positive history, it will be beyond fascinating. And we also finally, I'm talking way too much, but I've been living this day in and day out. We need to continue to drive wedges within the Iranian leadership. If you think about really the structure of that country, it's a garden variety military dictatorship with a patina of religiosity, quite frankly. And Khamenei really needs, in my opinion, to hold on to power through the production, or at least the threat, of a nuclear weapon. The Revolutionary Guards run the country's businesses. They're beginning to really feel the pinch. And that may be where the leverage is, along with the younger cohort there. But again, I don't want to be a Pollyanna here. This is a very complicated and dangerous situation. I've talked way too much, and I want to hear from my friends up here.
Admiral, any comments on coalitions there?
Coalitions,
In understanding the threat posed by Iran and the fact that we're not the only country that needs to oppose that threat.
sure. I think that we have a very large coalition of countries across the world who are recognizing and have recognized for a long time. You know, this has been a subject of academic discussion for decades, at least two, since I've been in the military, about what is the consequence of Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon. And our European partners are quite resolute in this regard. Our partners in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the Gulf countries, are quite resolute in this regard. Clearly, Israel's very resolute in this regard. And there are other countries, Australia, other friends around the world, that clearly recognize that this would be a real challenge if Iran, or an irresponsible nation or irresponsibly led nation, were to obtain that. So we've got a very strong backing, and I think the key is to keep it together, to keep the sanctions moving in the right direction, and to give them an opportunity to work. And that's our policy right now, is to try to do that. But it's a multi-vector approach. As you know, as a diplomat, a great deal of diplomacy is being expended in this regard. A lot of economic and financial powers being expended in this regard. Law enforcement power, the FBI did a fantastic job with this case, with the ambassador from Saudi Arabia being threatened. And of course, as the Senator said, and as the President has said, all options are on the table. So there's a military dimension to this. But I think we have to be cautious in the use of force, and that's the President's call, of course.
Right.
If I just add to that, talking about coalition building, many levels of coalition building to face any threat. And one thing I think we've seen since 9/11 is coalition building at the political level, military level. But what I've seen is the coalition building at the intelligence community and law enforcement level. And after 9/11, that was not something that just automatically happened. A lot of people rallied to our side because they saw the horror that had been inflicted on us. But our intelligence and law enforcement partners, especially in Europe, had to change course. They had to become much more aggressive in terms of trying to root out terrorists. They had to see that they had a common threat with us, and that it was our common interest in working closely together. So I think we've seen that. There's a template forged in that regard after 9/11, and I think we're seeing it with every crisis since then, and probably seeing it with Iran as well.
In that regard, when I worked on North Korea, there were a lot of people who felt we should deal directly with the North Koreans, and we did, but we did it on a platform with other countries. And it was very important for the North Koreans to understand that they were not just dealing with the U.S., they were dealing with all their neighbors who also didn't accept that this country that cannot feed itself should be developing nuclear weapons. Now, the North Koreans are not what I would call fast learners. This is going to take some time, but as of today, and I think it starts tomorrow, we have our envoy in the six-party process, extremely capable Foreign Service officer named Glenn Davies, and he is meeting with the North Koreans in Beijing. And an important part of what we're doing in meeting with them is to show the public in Korea, in South Korea, that gets very worried when there's no communication, because after all, they're within a few miles of North Korea. I mean, Seoul is about as far from North Korea as Colorado Springs is from here, Mr. Congressman. So the South Koreans want to see that we're really doing our best there. And I think we've dispatched a very, very capable diplomat and a team to talk to the North Koreans, and importantly talk to China, because I think in China we have a country that if we can work it out well. And if the kind of old think that goes on in China right now, which would be North Korean demise and American victory, our loss, if we can kind of get over this zero-sum thinking in China, I think we could maybe make some progress, because I think China has some leverage with the North Koreans. So this is, I think, an important thing to kind of keep at.
Does not China play really the crucial role in this question? I know there was the old saying that the French, who had a long history of enmity with the Germans, were so fond of Germany that they liked the fact there were two of them. That's a tongue-in-cheek comment. And I've heard the same thing said about China. They like Korea so much, they like the fact that there are two of them, because they have a long historical record of competing, of warring, of not always the fondest feelings for each other.
The difference is I don't recall the Koreans ever marching through Beijing, as I seem to recall the Germans doing now and again through Paris. I think I think what we do need to keep in mind is the Korean Peninsula needs the final settlement in the Korean Peninsula, first of all, needs to happen. And Korean people have a right to determine how it happens. They have a right to unification. They have a historical right to unification. But how that happens is not just their business, it's a lot of people's business, including our own. So I think the goal should be to try to reduce the tensions and manage the problem. I would love to see the North Koreans, I'd love to see Kim Jong-un fall out of bed. Well, actually, I'd just like to see him fall out of bed, but fall out of bed and realize that these nuclear weapons that they're developing, and by the way, they've tested two of them. They've tested two plutonium weapons, that this will have nothing to do with helping their country through its very difficult future. And I think we have a number of options to deal with North Korea, and there too, I would take nothing off the table. But I think it's very important that we keep at it, that the South Koreans know that we're serious about finding a solution, and that the Chinese increasingly come to understand that in finding a solution, we're not looking for a solution at Chinese expense. We're looking for win-win. And I know many Chinese think win-win is some kind of Burmese dissident or something. Actually, win-win is a concept that I think the Chinese could try to embrace.
Don't stop,
So-
he's on a roll.
I just love talking about North Korea.
You know, Chris, I just wanna tell you that-
pick them up and hug them. It's.
Chris, I just want to tell you that my many friends from Colorado Springs here tonight are a heck of a lot more responsible than those guys. Come on, guys. Anyway. One of the things that we've said, one of the things that Secretary Clinton has said is that we're not going to pay for the same thing twice with the North Koreans anymore. We've been in this cycle where North Korea will feel a little pressure, they will start rattling sabers, they'll do some irresponsible act, and that brings everybody back to the table, get these guys back under control, and Secretary Clinton has said we're not going to do that again, and I think we're going to see a pretty tough line this time around in Korea, in North Korea. And the North Koreans are hurting right now. They have the worst famine they've had in a long time. They need to feed their people, and obviously you don't want to hold that over anybody's head, but they have a concern about the stability, their own stability. So there is a little bit of a bargaining chip there, and we think potentially we could make some progress this time around, but we're not going to pay for the same ground twice.
I agree. Senator, you want to follow up on that? Yeah.
I think you've covered the waterfront nicely, and what really strikes me is how close North Korea is to Seoul, and that threat that just overarches that country day in, day out. And thank you for all the work you did there. I know there's nobody that wants a solution more badly than you do. You invested a lot of time and money and opportunity cost in
I
those
didn't
efforts.
invest any money in it, I'll tell you
That's-
that. But, but I wonder maybe if we could kind of shift back to this, and it's kind of related to Asia in another sense. We've pulled out of Iraq, and we're pulling out of Afghanistan. And I think there's a kind of broad question, what are we leaving behind? Are we leaving the wherewithal in those countries to kind of deal with their problems? Are we leaving an impression that we don't have enough stick-to-itiveness. Now, I'll answer my own question. I think we have shown the world that we mean business when we go into a country, and there's just no country that has done what we've done in that sense. But I mean, what is the impression you think we've left? And I wonder if we can kind of talk about that overall situation right now. Senator.
I desperately want Iraq to succeed. I think to comment in the short number of months since we've fully withdrawn our combat forces about the future prospects of Iraq is short-sighted, and it's too soon to draw any definitive conclusions. I think we all would have wished, and I haven't talked to the Admiral about this, to have seen a long-term security agreement with Iraq, where we would have continued to have a presence to train their military, their police, offer the kind of assistance that we do, I think, in close to 100 countries. We have strong military-to-military relationships all over the world. I think many of you here know what a great service our military provides in that regard. It's one of the reasons that the revolution in Egypt was so peaceful. Our military leaders were talking to the Egyptian military leadership cohort. And unlike Syria, where al-Assad has shown himself to be his father's son, the Egyptian army did not attack the Egyptian citizens. There are conversations with the Iraqis about a long ongoing relationship. I think, Chris, you put it well when you talked about their local politics. Maliki has his hands full. I have been worried about seemingly some of the purges of Sunnis in his government. The Kurds are self-sufficient, but they're a key to a strong, united Iraq. And I don't know that Maliki has included the Kurdish leadership in the ways that would be productive going forward. But we spent our reputation, our treasure, and most importantly, American lives in Iraq. And there's nobody more than me that wants it to be successful on Iraqi terms. I'm not as worried as some that Iraq will sign an unholy alliance with Iran. The nationalistic sentiments in Iraq are pretty well established. And they've long been suspicious of Iranian, parentheses, Persian influence. But we can't ignore Iraq. We shouldn't be in a mood that our feelings were hurt because they asked us to leave. We need to redouble our efforts. And look, after all, they saw us as occupiers. They're proud people. Their political leaders in various forms have played the American presence for their own political purposes. So I think there are reasons that we're where we are. But I remain hopeful that Iraq will find its way to a more democratic, capitalistic system that will create some stability in the Middle East.
Chris, and it's hard to speak about Iraq when you've got the real experts sitting here on the stage, but
Grading us.
right.
Yeah.
But Iraq is probably never going to be a Jeffersonian democracy, but it is an opportunity for representative government to gain a foothold in that very troubled part of the world. And through the sacrifices of a great number of men and women in uniform, a number of very talented diplomats, young and old diplomats, and USAID workers, and just a whole host of coalition partners who were there with us, we have, I think, over the last 8 years now, 9 years, placed them in a place where they have an opportunity to succeed. And it is a tumultuous form of democracy with three very scratchy factions, as you well know, Ambassador. But what gives us hope, I think, is that they tend to get to the brink of fracturing, and then they pull back. And it is an opportunity for representative government to have a foothold. And I think one of the things that we ought to be watchful for, first of all, we have the largest diplomatic mission from our nation is in Iraq right now. Many diplomats on the ground there are doing great work under fairly difficult conditions. And our sense is that the Iraqis were like sort of pushing your son or daughter out the door. At the end of December, they just wanted to make a statement about their sovereignty, which is one of the reasons why we don't have a large troop presence there right now. But they have sent the signals to us all along that they would like to have a robust training relationship with us. And I think sooner or later, as long as they can hold their stuff together, that we'll be back in there on a very reasonable scale, very similar to other nations in the region that we train with and who we support. And I think it will work out in the long run. And there are a lot of other nations in the Middle East. A lot of young people are watching this and hoping that it succeeds.
Ken, you were in the White House in some very tough times in Iraq. I'm sure you were in with the president on a number of occasions. I wonder if you can talk retrospectively and prospectively about how you see the situation.
I was in the White House in 2008 to 2009, so things were there was improvement, but it was still terribly troubling, and obviously that was one of the centerpieces of President Bush's 8 years of work in the White House. And I think there's no small satisfaction in the positive developments that we've seen over the last few years, thanks in large part to the entities represented by the people on either side of me, the diplomatic efforts and the military efforts. But I can tell you that there was serious anxiety whenever there was any incident, whenever there was anything that looked like sectarian strife was going to get out of hand again. They'd seen what had happened. They were terribly afraid of anything, seeing a repeat of what had happened in the aftermath of the invasion, and wanted to take every step possible to try to prevent it from spreading any farther. But if I could actually just go back to your question about what we leave. We talked about what we leave in Iraq, and then you also asked about what we leave in Afghanistan. And I think it's important that we all recognize the reason why Afghanistan was so important to our national security. And I believe it was you, Ambassador, who said that's where it all began. It being the 9/11 plot evolved out of there because that was a safe haven. And it was a safe haven under the Taliban. It was a safe haven for a number of historical reasons, dating back to the fact that that's where a number of like-minded extremists had congregated in opposition to the Soviets. It's a place that is prone to extremism, and it's a place that was relatively ungoverned, and so therefore is hospitable to a terrorist group establishing a command and control center and then launching attacks around the world. That is no longer the case, but we all have to keep our eye on the prevention of that happening again, and Afghanistan falling back into the position of being a safe haven for a regeneration of core al-Qaeda. At this point, thanks to the efforts over the last few years, core al-Qaeda is on the run. It's its operations have been disrupted, its leadership has been decimated, but it wouldn't take much complacency on our part to allow a safe haven to recur in that area. And obviously, that's not the only place in the world you look at. You look anywhere there's ungoverned regions, whether it's Somalia or Yemen or Afghanistan. Those are the areas where you have to worry about these kind of terrorist entities getting a foothold, getting strength, getting the capacity to launch attacks overseas, and then, heaven forbid, launch the next 9/11.
Senator, what's your sense of the politics in Afghanistan? Is Karzai kind of up to this?
I was hoping you'd answer that question. President Karzai is charming. He's Western educated. He's smart. He's the product of a tribal environment. He lives in fear, or the people around him, of a car bomb, an attack like the one that killed his brother, who was a leader in Kandahar, one of the important provinces in the south. He alternately frustrates and elevates our hopes for the future. One of the big questions about President Karzai will he step down in 2014? My sense is that he will. Then who's going to be leading Afghanistan? Who will be running for the presidency at the same time that we're really beginning to fully draw down our combat forces? Now, let me just say more broadly, I think we're on the right trajectory in Afghanistan. There's some who think we ought to leave sooner. There are others that think we ought to stay for a longer period of time on the combat side. We're going to need, and Ken alluded to this, a longer-term relationship with Afghanistan, a security agreement, if you will, that hopefully will be focused on training their ANSF, their Afghan National Security Forces, local police, their national police, and their army, so they can defend their borders, they can manage their internal affairs, and they can prevent al-Qaeda from ever taking root in Afghanistan. again. We've got a long road to travel. We took our eye off the ball in Afghanistan. We fought a series of one-year conflicts. We didn't really, and there are some who would probably disagree. I don't think we really had a strategy there. It was why I alluded to the setting aside where we are in Iraq now, why I thought we should have finished the job in Afghanistan first. But I would add one other major concern. I think the Admiral would agree with me. It's very difficult to beat an insurgency with a counterinsurgency when the insurgents have the safe havens. Safe havens are in Pakistan. And until those safe havens are shut down or pressured more than they are now, particularly by the Pakistanis, it's going to be difficult to win the kind of complete victory that we want. The Haqqani network you've heard about is vicious. They're, by all accounts, given tacit approval by some in the Pakistani government. And I know the Admiral and I would love to see the Haqqani network neutered. It would go a long way to protecting our men and women who are over there fighting on behalf of the Afghan people.
If I could ask the Admiral to comment on that. There was a very high-profile trip a few months ago led by the Secretary of State to essentially confront the Pakistanis on the Haqqani network. And you sort of have the impression that the Pakistani government, because they cannot manage the problem themselves, for whatever reason, and I suspect there are a number of reasons, because they cannot manage the problem of the Haqqani network, they try to tell us that that's not the network we really ought to be focusing on. They try to then, because they can't manage it, they try to tell us it's not really a problem anyway. Anyway, I wonder if, Admiral, you can talk about dealing with the Pakistanis on some of these issues.
You know, Chris, if I told you how nice it is to be back in Colorado, it truly is, by the way. The Pakistanis are partners, but they're very, very difficult partners. Probably the most difficult partners we have across the world. But I would rather have them as partners than not have them as partners, because it's a terribly important part of the world. They do have nuclear weapons. They do have an entree with China, and probably very important and relevant to this discussion is they have tremendous influence with the issues we have in Afghanistan. So as difficult as they are, and I can outline for hours the challenges associated with that partnership, they've also been a good partner in some areas. They've helped us with intelligence. They've helped us. They've lost an awful lot of soldiers along the border. And there are some positive aspects of the relationship. We'd like to move that forward. But Secretary Clinton's meeting with their foreign minister tomorrow. It's going to be an interesting discussion because of some of the recent events that we've had with the cross-border attack that unfortunately killed 24 Pakistani soldiers, where mistakes were made on both sides, which the Pakistanis have had a hard time getting across. Perhaps it's a stalking horse for other issues that they wanted to raise with us. But we need to get this relationship back on track because, as the Senator pointed out, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to succeed with the mission in Afghanistan if the safe havens are active.
Can you agree, a relationship too big to fail, too important to fail?
It is. It's terribly complex. I, once again, saw it from the perspective of working at the intelligence level and at the law enforcement level, and there were times where they were brilliantly effective and brilliantly cooperative. Other times where they would just be inexplicably difficult, and it was sort of hard to understand. And part of it was trying to understand the passion of their feelings vis-a-vis India, and how that just seems to color every policy decision they make. Every decision whether to cooperate with us or not seems to be looked at through that prism, because that just seems to be the biggest focus of their lives, and there was an irrational element to it. So that was very frustrating, but I will say there were times that they really came through for us, and were very strong. Other times quite the opposite.
So within some of the intel relationships, as the Admiral was alluding, they have come through for us. They've cooperated.
Yeah, and you can read about how the ISI, the intelligence services, there are different parts of the ISI, and there are parts that it's known that you can pretty much trust and work with that part. The other part is probably as soon as you walk out the door after your meeting, everybody grins and shakes hands, they're on the phone with the county network.
You know, it's interesting in the context of my career, there are times when a certain government, who from the general public's point of view is a pretty terrible government in country X, but they've worked with us on some very key things. They've remanded terrorists, for example. They've done things that we don't talk about. We don't talk about publicly because we've agreed that we will never address that publicly, but we know about it within the government. And yet, the New York Times doesn't know about it, and nor are we going to tell them, so they kind of have half the story. And it is a little frustrating at times to see countries kind of really held up on a stake there, when in fact that country may have done some things for us that we can't talk about. So
Chris, I think earlier the senator referred to Pakistan, I think very appropriately, as both the arsonist and the fireman. And there are examples abound, but we would love for them, for example, to quit allowing calcium ammonium nitrate fertilizer coming across the border into Afghanistan so it can be made into improvised explosive devices. But at the same time, we're about to put Khalid Sheikh Mohammed on trial, who's the lead 911 plotter, and we would not be doing this unless Pakistan had handed him over to us. So it's one of those classic love-hate relationships, and again, better to have them as a partner than an enemy.
Just to follow on your point about some governments that might not be the most savory in many ways being very helpful in the counterterrorism area, there are a number of instances I can think of involving governments that have turned over in the Arab Spring. And so obviously, given the Arab Spring and the Arab thing, there are serious implications for our counterterrorism efforts over there because of the disruption of those relationships.
all right, well, enough with that difficult problem. Let's go to an easy one, Syria. Now, as I understand it, in Syria, you got Darth Vader over here and Ewok villages over there. But Senator, you're suggesting that may be a little more complicated than that?
Syria is very complicated. You have a Alawite Shia minority that runs the country. The al-Assad family is an example, a leading example of that Shia sect. You have an uprising that's driven more by Sunni Syrians than not. Christians are concerned that were Sunnis to overthrow the Assad government, that they may be persecuted. And unfortunately, there have been some incidents along those lines. There are also other religious minorities, as well as Kurds in the southeastern corner of Syria. Having said all of that, I think on balance, it would be a benefit to the world and to the region if the al-Assad regime fell. What follows is the big question. I read an history piece, I can mention the New York Times here, I think. Today in the New York Times that analyzed where the Israeli government was, and the Israeli government's having a significant conversation among its leaders about whether Syria's fall would unleash chaos, which would affect Israel's stability, or not. And on balance, I think the Israelis think that this will happen, it needs to happen, it should happen at some time in history, even though the risks are great. The prize, if that's the right term, would be worth it. As to what we should do, we should continue to encourage the Arab League. Although the observer mission was a failure, we should continue to urge the Arab League to be a strong participant. We need to jawbone Russia and China, who vetoed a Security Council resolution to sanction further Syria. We should, in our own way with our European partners, continue to implement sanctions on Syria. We can encourage the Turks to broaden the refugee areas that are along their border. We can set up a contact group to funnel humanitarian aid. And we should continue to have the discussion about whether we arm the rebels. But as I said in my remarks, we don't really know who the rebels are. And we although we're desperate to stop the killing, I think we need to know more about who the rebels are. Al-Qaeda reportedly has moved from Iraq and some other areas into Syria. And this is why the politics to say the least, in this part of the world are very complex. And your enemy of your enemy may be my enemy too, or the enemy of your enemy may be my friend. It's just, it's a very, very challenging situation. But I know we all, in the end, see Assad for who he is. And I think by that, I mean, I think he's a puppet. I think he's, and I may be offending somebody by saying that, I think there are forces behind him in Syrian society that continue to keep him in place until those forces see an advantage or a reason for the regime to fall. I think this terrible civil war will continue. And the difference between Libya and Syria, final comment, Muammar Gaddafi was a pariah. Muammar Gaddafi had no allies. Muammar Gaddafi had an army that was vaguely interested in the chain of command. By contrast, Syria has allies. It has a big military. And obviously the leadership of the country is willing to use it against their own citizens.
Admiral, we must be meeting new friends in the context of this change in just historic change in the Arab world. There must be new people we're getting to know that we didn't know before. I would think Libya is one of those. And then there must be some old friends that we've kind of lost and we're not sort of sure who we're going to meet. I mean, our military does well because they have these counterparts all over the world, and yet everything's been kind of turned upside down. How does it affect how we do there?
Well, I can tell you with confidence we didn't have a lot of military counterparts in Syria or Libya, but we do have a very good and solid relationship with our military counterparts in Egypt. And I would tell you that in the darkest days, a year ago, when they were in the convulsions that they were going through in Egypt, that one of the things that kept the military from engaging its own people, which is terribly important, was the fact that we had a strong military-to-military relationship, and Admiral Mullen was able to call his counterparts over there and urge them to not do the wrong thing, but to do the difficult right thing. And we've all seen what happened as a result. And this is a pattern that's repeated itself. As you recall, when Russia invaded Georgia, no one in our government was speaking with the Russians at all, except for Admiral Mullen and General Makarov, because we had essentially broken off contact. So maintaining those relationships is an absolutely critical part of our diplomacy, frankly. And
Ken, any comments from your perspective on? I think it was on your watch that the Georgia-Russia war started.
I'll take the blame for that.
Yeah, you didn't prevent that. As I recall,
Got
it
a
was
weak
like
guy at the HSA that was
like
going.
the first day of the Olympics, as I recall.
It was. In fact, I think Putin and President Bush were in the audience together. And as I recall, our president gave their president a piece of his mind about it. I would like to just comment on Syria. Senator Udall mentioned the concern about Al-Qaeda in Iraq, coming over and joining in the effort in Syria to unseat the government. And that it's become clear that that is a focus of core Al-Qaeda. In other words, the core Al-Qaeda over in the Pakistan safe havens over there. Zawahiri, the now #1 since the killing of bin Laden, recently released a 10-minute videotape lauding the efforts of the rebels, the revolutionaries in Syria, trying to align Al-Qaeda with them so they can get a foothold and they can help color that rebellion or uprising with their own ideology. He's failed that miserably. In fact, I think over the last year, one might say that the killing of bin Laden is the biggest blow that Al-Qaeda has suffered, but an argument could be made that the Arab Spring is equally devastating to Al-Qaeda because it just left Al-Qaeda behind. And Zawahiri, he tried, he's from Egypt. He was tortured in the cells back in the 60s in Egypt. He has street cred among the Egyptians. He tried to insert himself with videos and the like in Egypt. It was ignored. And Al-Qaeda's been ignored. And I think the Arab Spring, one of the most beautiful things about it for me is it was a total repudiation of Al-Qaeda. They're trying to remedy that situation now with Syria, and the hope is that they'll get no traction there like they've gotten on the rest of the Middle East.
Can I say one other thing about Syria?
You can say as many things as you want.
I mentioned the Israeli government. Syria is Iran's greatest ally. And were the Syrian government to fall, Iran is further isolated. And that in itself is a reason, I believe, to root for the fall of the Syrian government, particularly if we as a world community and the leaders in the region could manage that transition. There are, I think, some real upsides. Hamas has already left Damascus. Hezbollah, the Lebanon-based Iranian proxy, is also becoming very fidgety and looking for its next safe haven, if you will. And there could be, although again I don't want to be a Pollyanna here, real benefits to Lebanon, which is arguably been a client state of Syria. This isn't going to happen overnight, these more positive developments. But that's another part of the Syrian conflict that we should all keep in mind. And I interrupted that.
You were going to say the same thing I was going to say, that Assad's days are numbered, and the fall of Syria, Syria's current regime is going to be a tremendous blow to Iran and Lebanese household. So.
Senator, I wonder if I can put you on the spot and ask you, what do you think the Middle East is going to look like in 5 years? Is Egypt going to be okay? I'm not going to ask the Admiral that because he'll have to deal with.
Yes. I'll answer if the Admiral can, and you'll all make the comments as well. Look, each one of these countries has to be taken in its own right. Let me share a story and then let others comment on other countries. I was in Munich a few weeks ago at the Wehrkunde, the International Security Conference. I know the Admirals attended on a number of occasions. It started in 1960 when the NATO countries linked arms for different strategic and security reasons, but now it's attended by almost all the world's foreign ministers. One of the real highlights of that weekend, it's about 60 hours, you just put up with your jet lag. And for me, 60 hours is equal to reading 60 books and what I learned viscerally in meeting people. We met with the Tunisian president, Jebali. What a man. He was 16 years in prison. I don't know, Chris, if you had a chance to meet him. He just smiles all the time because of what his country now has as an opportunity. Tunisia, about 4 million people, if my numbers are right, small little country, is on the best track right now to put some democratic institutions in place and also find some economic opportunities. We ought to invest in Tunisia. They need about $1 billion a year. That's not chump change, but it would be money well spent, and it could be part of a larger Arab, we have to rename the fund, Arab Spring Investment Fund that we ought to put in place. Libya is going to hold elections. There's a long way to go there, and I think we're all concerned about Egypt, and maybe I'll defer to the Admiral and others to comment on Egypt because there's some good news there, but there's some developments that really concern us all.
I wonder if we can have somewhat of a change of focus to some of the homeland security issues, and we have one of the best experts here to talk about. Ken, if you were in the White House today, I mean, how would that have evolved from a few years ago? And what are we really looking at in terms of things that we need to worry about? We seem to have the metal detector situation down at the airport, but what other things do we need to deal with?
Yeah, the metal detector thing is taken care of. In fact, as we were coming here, I was with my dad last night, and we had forgotten a little small penknife, and instead of them throwing it in the trash can, they actually had a process where they automatically stuck it in a FedEx bag and put it in the mail and sent it back to you, which I thought, that was great. That's a real step forward. So there's my shout out for TSA. Anyway, so we're seeing progress there. I think in terms of just generally counterterrorism, our general counterterrorism capabilities, I think it's important to look at how far we've come since 9/11 in the last 10 and a half years. I think mention has been made here about how much has happened in regard to, I think as the Admiral was saying, in terms of our intelligence community, speaking with our military, speaking with other intelligence agencies overseas, and as I've seen it from my perspective, speaking with the law enforcement world. We are, in terms of coordinating and information sharing in the counterterrorism space, we have just come light years since 9/11. That speaks a little bit to where we were beforehand, but I think that's largely because we just didn't see the threat that 9/11 was until 9/11 happened. Once it did, that was the clarion call for real change, and we've seen that in the intelligence and the law enforcement communities, and obviously in the military and the diplomatic corps. I think that we have done a good job, frankly, at protecting the homeland, both by hardening it by the efforts of DHS and its partners, but also by interrupting plots before they become reality. I mean, you just read the newspapers this week. Some guy wanted to strap a vest on and go blow himself up in the U.S. Capitol, and the FBI and their partners did a great job. It was really a masterful piece of work at getting that guy. And there have been countless such episodes over the last couple of years, many of them undercover operations like this, where there are sting operations, but taking bad guys out and also disrupting operations, making any cell members who might be here thinking about doing bad things think twice, because they never know when the FBI might be on them. That is a level of sort of getting themselves into our adversaries' networks and operations that we just didn't have 10 years ago. And so I think I've seen tremendous progress through the time I was in government up until 2009, and I've continued to see tremendous progress. But as the senator said, they only need to get one up on us once, and we're hurting. So it's a big task.
Admiral, any?
I would share Ken's sentiments that we've come an awful long way since 9/11, and heaven's sake, we should have, because it was a terrible attack on our country, the worst we've ever experienced, and the communities, as I mentioned earlier, have come together very well. We need to stay vigilant. There are a couple of things I would say. One is that one of our best sensors that we have is the American public. The Times Square bomber was picked off by somebody who walked by a car and something seemed wrong, said something to somebody, and lo and behold, that attack didn't take place. So, we're not out of the woods. And as I also mentioned, they only have to be, good once. We have to be good 100% of the time. The other thing you may want to transition to this topic later, so I apologize for preempting you, is we have to keep our eye on the ball on the cyber piece. Because not only is this potential state threat, it's also a potential terrorist threat. You could have a super empowered individual, I think as Tom Friedman has referred to them, or a state proxy that has gone off on a tangent. And the next thing you know, you could have a very serious cyber attack on the country. So we got to keep our eye on the ball there.